Here in episode 9, we are going to use 3D texturing software to make our model look like a real thing. Texturing your 3D models is an art form all of its own, and it takes a lot of practice and learning different techniques to make stuff look really good. You'll want to devote plenty of time to playing around, getting ideas, and trying things out. I'm still a novice at this, but hopefully I can teach you a couple things that might be useful. For this tutorial, I'm going to be following a pre-prepared script, which is boring, but it will A, save time, and B, help you get results similar to mine. I have to be honest though, this takes away a lot of the fun of texturing. Instead of exploring what different options look like, I'm going to be giving you exact instructions, even down to the hex values for the specific colors. With that said, you should feel free to go off script and make these donuts look however you want. There isn't a right way or a wrong way to texture a model. The only goal is to get something that looks great out the other side. To get started, load up the save that we made in the previous video, just after we finished importing all of our pre-baked maps. If you've been playing around and you have any layers in there right now, go ahead and right-click on them and select Delete Layer. And then do me a favor and set your lighting up here to Studio, and also in the Display tab, put the light intensity around 1.2. This way, your donuts will hopefully look more like mine and transition better to the Skyrim lighting when we're done. Before you start texturing anything, ever, be sure to have reference photos handy. This is crucial to your success. I pulled up some donut examples from Google and just put them into a nifty little program called PureRef, which can be pinned so that it stays on top. I'll put the link to PureRef in the description. I'm going to start with a base layer by clicking this button here for Add Solid Layer, then click the little color circle for the albedo image and set the color to 424242, which is just a slightly darker gray. Having this base layer is not required, but it's going to be helpful for us later on. Next, we will start by building the vanilla donut dough part. We could make this totally from scratch, but we're going to borrow some existing textures from the Mixer library instead. There aren't any bread textures, or any food for that matter, in the material packs that came with Mixer's install, so we're going to fake it. Click this button here to add a surface layer, tick the Categories box here to filter for concrete, and then scroll down and click on the image to select this rough concrete texture. Once it loads in, double-click on this new layer and rename it to Vanilla Base. At the moment, Mixer is applying this texture to the entire model, but that's not what we want. We want to only use it on the vanilla dough parts, and this is what our Material ID map is for. So click the little ID button down here at the bottom, then hold down Q and click on the part of the model that you want to assign. Now, in true Murphy's Law fashion, when I tested this before, it worked fine. And I'm going to hope that yours worked fine and you only have the new texture showing on the vanilla donut dough. Since mine is not cooperating, I have to do a workaround. I'm going to select everything on this list, which is a lot, more than we actually put on the model, which I'll talk about later, and then I'll also tick the button at the bottom for Invert. That basically achieves the same result, just the long way around. And to reiterate, don't do all that if yours was already fine. Alright, we now have this concrete texture showing on just the vanilla donut parts. Click on that layer to select it, and then open the Placement drop-down and change the scale to about 65 so the grain is sized more appropriately for our donuts. Now let's change the color. Close the Placement pane and the Blend pane to tidy up, and then click on the color dot next to albedo. I chose a color that has a hex value of 5C3004, so you can type that into the box here, or feel free to pick a different color from the wheel, and then hit Apply. Now expand the albedo pane and let's bring the contrast way down to about 0.2 so that it's not quite so exciting. To add just a little bit of shine to the dough, click the little color dot next to roughness and turn that down a bit by making it darker. I used a gray color here that has a hex value of B3, B3, B3. You may notice some bleeding of color around the sprinkles and icing. We're going to ignore that for now because it may fix itself when we start coloring other parts of the donuts. If it doesn't, we will tidy it up later. Alright, we've added a surface layer to our model which gives it a base grain, and if you have a quick look at just the normal map view, you can see how it is adding this information to the baked normal map that we imported. Next, we need to work on the color of these donuts. Looking at our reference images, we can see that donuts are not all one color. To make them look realistic, we need to create this area in the middle of each donut where the dough does not brown as much during the cooking process. To do this, we first need to add a solid layer by clicking the little plain square button up here. I highly recommend organizing your layers as you go along, so double-click and give it a relevant name. I'm going with line 1. Now we only want this layer to apply to the vanilla donuts, so we need to assign the material ID again. To make this easy, I'll just copy the ID map from the previous layer by selecting it, right-clicking and copy ID mask, and then in the new layer, right-click and paste ID mask. We don't want white, so I'll select that new layer, which is being a little stubborn, so I'll just click the vanilla base and then click back to our new layer again. And then I'll click the little color circle next to albedo and type in a hex value of 977C51, which I got by picking a color earlier from the wheel here. And I'm going to click the little dot by roughness and change this to a value of A0, 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 which will increase the shine. Now you may have noticed by now that turning down roughness increases shine, or gloss as we call it, since those are opposites of each other. Now clearly we have to do something else at this point because we don't want this new color to be on the entire donut. This is where we finally get to see the beauty of masks in action. Remember that a mask is a grayscale image, meaning it only has white, black, and shades of gray, that controls where your layer's data will show through. White means it shows in full, black means it doesn't show at all, and gray will show different amounts depending on how light or dark the gray color is. In Mixer, we add masks by creating a mask stack. Let's do that now by either right-clicking on the layer and selecting Add Mask Stack, or by clicking on the little button down here that looks like a square with a circle in it. The mask stack starts off empty, so it doesn't do anything. We have to add mask components and mask modifiers, which we can do by selecting the mask stack, which is this little box here in the layer, and then choosing what we want to add over here on the right-hand side. As I mentioned, there are mask components, which is represented as a little square with a circle in it here, and there are mask modifiers, which is represented by the 3 little horizontal pinhead lines. You can find out what all of these do by checking the Mixer manual, or watching the Mixer Fundamentals series, or just playing around with them. To create this line in the middle of the donut, we're going to use a position gradient mask. So click the Mask Components button up here, the square with a circle in it, and choose Position Gradient. Hit 9 on your keyboard, which goes to the Layer Mask view, and you can see what this mask is doing. When you slide the little bars here for range, you can move where the mask goes. And hitting 1 again on your keyboard to go back to the full PBR view, you can see the effect that this has for applying the color of this surface layer onto our model. Hit 9 again so you can see the mask. Then make sure you have Above ticked and move the little range bars to position the line. Since your model will not be identical to mine, you'll probably have to play with these values to get the line where you want it. Mine looks about right when I set the lower value to 0.81 and the upper value to 0.91. Hit 1 on the keyboard to make sure you're happy with the overall final look, and then tweak these values more if needed. But we aren't done because, of course, we need the line to be only in the middle of the donut. So we can add another position gradient on top of the first one to control the other side. First, I'll hit 9 to go back to Layer Mask View, and then click the Components button and select Position Gradient. You'll see that this is now overwriting what we had before. So to make it do what I want, which is take information from both of these mask layers, I'll click the Blending Mode drop-down here and change it from Normal to Multiply. Blending modes are very important because they allow you to get all kinds of different results when you put one image on top of another. Have a look here at the Mixer manual to get a good idea of what each one does. Multiply is probably the one that you will use most often. For this second position gradient, we want it to come up from the opposite side, so tick the button for Below, and then play with the little range bars until you get the line where you want. For me, this was a lower value of 0.127 and an upper value of 0.151. Hit 1 to see the final result, and I think this looks nice. We've now got the line for our top donut. To do the rest of the donuts, we just do the same thing over and over. Duplicate the Line 1 surface layer by right-clicking on it and selecting Duplicate Layer. Then double-click on the new layer and rename it to Line 2. Now click on the mask stack for the Line 2 layer, which is this little black box here, and we can quickly fit this to the next donut, or donuts depending on how your model is set up, by just adjusting both of the position gradients. You should be able to leave all the settings as they are and just hold Shift while sliding the range bars so they will move simultaneously. I ended up fiddling with mine a bit, but the final values here were 0.563 to 0.664 for the bottom layer, and 0.373 to 0.397 for the top one. Repeat the process for the next set of donuts. Duplicate the layer, rename it, click the mask stack to select it, and then hold Shift while sliding the position gradient bars. My final values for line 3 were 0.317 to 0.418 for the bottom layer, and 0.619 to 0.643 for the top one. Now you may have noticed when we did this set of donuts that our position gradient is not just affecting the horizontal donuts on the plate, but it's also affecting the one that we've got standing up at an angle here. We don't want this, and luckily, we can use another type of mask to prevent that from happening. Using the same principle that white on a mask equals parts that show and black equals parts that don't show, we can use something called a paint mask to remove this color where we don't want it. To add a paint mask, right-click on the layer and select Add Paint Mask, or click the little box with a squiggly line down here to do the same thing. You will get a new menu over here on the left. Paint masks have a lot of flexibility and many different uses. You can paint anything you want on your model. Colors, decals, text, whatever. And you can find out more about them in the Mixer manual or by watching the fundamentals video. We are only going to use a very basic function here, painting white or black to reveal or hide areas of the layer. I personally find it easier to do this on a flat image rather than the 3D model, so I'll click here to change it to the 2D view, but you can use whichever view you prefer. You can hopefully tell on this 2D layer which is the front angled donut that is accidentally being affected by our position gradient. If you have any trouble figuring that out, you can swap between the 2D and 3D views, and even use your Material ID map to help. We need to pinpoint the wrong donut and paint black over it so that it becomes invisible to this layer's data. With the paint mask selected, over here in the brush settings on the left, select the square since we have nice straight rectangles to work with on this image, and then change the brush size. The color should be set to black by default, but it's always a good idea to scroll down and check. Sorry about the overlay being in the way. You cannot change the properties of the paint mask once the brush has been used. You can only adjust the brush settings beforehand, so I suggest you have a quick look and make sure everything looks the way you want. Use your mouse to paint over the front donut's UV map, which will remove this light-colored layer's data from being applied to it. Remember that we are painting on the mask layer, not the actual albedo or color layer, so you aren't going to see black paint on your model. you can swap between views, either PBR, which is 1 on the keyboard, or Layer Mask, which is 9 on the keyboard, or other views by using the drop-down or other shortcut keys to help make this easier. Unfortunately, holding Shift or Shift-S to paint in a straight line does not work on 3D models, only on plane objects, so you just have to be careful here. Go slow, scroll in and out of the viewport, and change your brush size as needed. I'm just going to tidy this up a little bit by painting black over any other little white areas that shouldn't be there. These thin white lines on the bottom left are where the lighter colored dough is for the 2 donuts being affected by this particular layer. And the breaks in the lines are where the icing is dripping down over it. If I paint black over this one, and then go to my 3D model, you can see where I've hidden that part of the model from this layer. If you mess up and accidentally paint over parts that you shouldn't, don't despair. In the Paint Mask window, click the little eraser button up here and brush over the part that you need to fix. This will remove the black color from the mask, which means things will become visible again wherever the eraser touches. Okay, once that looks good, we need to add the light colored line to the last row of donuts. Duplicate the Line 1 surface layer, drag and drop it to the top of the layers, and double-click to rename it to Line 4. Then click on the mask stack for that new layer, hold Shift and adjust the range values of both position gradients. The final values I used were 0.063 to 0.164 for the lower layer, and then for the upper layer 0.873 to 0.897. As before, this position gradient is messing up our front donut, so we need to add a paint mask for this layer as well to block that out. Unfortunately, you can't just copy it from another layer, so we have to make a new one. Right-click and add paint mask. I'm going to go to 2D view, and then make sure to reselect the brush up here if you had used the eraser before, and paint black with a square brush over the area of the front donut to hide it from this layer's data. I like to use the Layer Mask view by hitting number 9, or the Active Mask view, which is number 0, but you can use PBR view, which is number 1 if you prefer. Remember, you can also paint directly on the 3D model if you want. If you have trouble remembering these shortcuts, don't worry, you can find a link to all of these in the description. Okay, when you're done, flip back to 3D view and look at the full PBR texture to make sure it looks good. If you need to fix anything, just select the paint mask, click on the eraser, and brush over parts to remove the black mask. We are almost done with this part, we just have one more donut. For this one, we have a small challenge because it's not sitting horizontally. This means we can't just get our gradient in the right place by moving the range values. But that's okay, because we are smarter than a donut. Let's duplicate the Line 1 layer again, drag and drop it to the top of the stack, and double-click to rename it. Before we worry about the position gradient range values, we need to add a mask modifier to move this whole thing onto the tilted donut. Mask modifiers are here under the 3 little pinhead horizontal lines. Click on that and select Projection from the list. Make sure it's at the very top of the mask stack. Click and drag it there if it's not. Yes, the order matters for everything in Mixer. Click where it says Tiling and change this to Freeform. Here you can change the rotation, scale, and XY offsets. For my model, I got off really easy, and all I had to do was put the X offset to 0.255 while leaving everything else alone. I believe what this is doing is moving across the UV map, not the actual model. And since we have nicely aligned rectangles for each donut on our UV map, we can just slide this across to the correct position in the UV space, and it displays correctly on the donut. Now, I did not need to change any of the position gradient values for mine, and I didn't need a paint mask this time either, but you should do whatever you need to make yours work well. When you're done, you should be looking at a nice pile of donuts that is reasonably true to your reference images. But, Houston, we have a problem. Everything is a bit too uniform. For one thing, the line here is a little too perfect. And for another, the side of this donut looks too smooth. there's just no variation at all. This kind of uniformity is the bane of 3D because nothing in real life is perfect, and the human eye knows that all too well. Which means that no matter how beautiful something might be, it will not look real if it's too perfect. So let's do something about both of these issues. First, the smoothness. I'm going to put some additional bumps into this lighter area. Select the Line 1 layer, so that the layer we add will go right above it, and then click the little square with the grid up here to add a surface layer. Scroll down to find Worn Concrete 2x2M and select it. Wait a moment for it to load, and then turn off the albedo and metalness maps for this layer because we don't want those. We just want the bumps and the roughness. In the placement pane, change the scale to 65 so it matches the size of our donuts a bit better. And now you'll be thinking that we've totally ruined our lovely donuts. We added more bumps, all right, but they're everywhere. So what was the point? Well, they don't have to be everywhere. We only want the bumps where our line is. And one easy way to do this is to clip this layer to the one below it. Hover over the new Worn Concrete layer and hold Alt. When you see the little down arrow, click, and it should pin this to the layer below, which will be indicated by the little down arrow over here in the layer list. This means that the clipped layer will be applied first to the layer that it's clipped to. And then that overall result is what gets thrown into the rest of the mix. So essentially, this will only add bumps where our Line 1 layer has data, and that's the middle part of the top donut. We want to do this for all the donuts, so duplicate that Worn Concrete layer by right-clicking on it and select Duplicate Layer. Go ahead and duplicate it 4 times so that we have 5 in total, or however many you need for the number of line layers that you have. Then drag one copy of the Worn Concrete layer on top of each line layer, and watch as we gradually destroy our donuts. It's okay, we're going to fix this. Hover over each Worn Concrete layer one at a time, and Alt-click to clip it to the line layer below. Your layer stack should look like this when you're done. The effect is subtle, but it makes a difference. Don't underestimate the power of fine detail when you're texturing your models. So that helps a little bit to fix the overall uniformity, and now we need to address these perfectly straight gradient lines. Luckily, we have some clever ways to break up perfection, and one great way is by adding noise. We can add noise to the mask stack for each of these line layers, and it pretty much does what it sounds like. It creates a little bit of chaos. Click on the mask stack, this little box here, for the Line 1 layer, and then collapse both the position gradient panes to make some space. Select the topmost position gradient so that our new mask will be added on top of it, and then in the Mask Components option, which again is the little square with a circle, choose Noise and then Simplex, or you can try one of the other noise options if you want. It starts off as normal blending mode, which just overwrites all the stuff below it. So click on that drop-down and set this to Overlay instead. Then play around with the settings until you achieve an effect that you like. I ended up with the values shown here: amplitude 2, frequency 20, octaves 2, lacunarity 3, persistence 0.5. Seed is just a randomizer, so you can change that to get slightly different patterns based on the options that you've chosen. You may notice that the noise is affecting the whole area of the line, smudging right across it so that we end up with some dark splotches in the very middle. This is not really ideal because that's not how real donuts look. I just want the edge of the lighter color to have a little noise, not the entire width of the line. To achieve this, we can clip this mask layer like we did with the Worn Concretes. Collapse the noise mask so it's easier to see what we're doing, then hover over it, hold Alt, and click to clip it to the upper position gradient. And now you can see how the noise is only being applied there. It's not as straightforward to add noise to the bottom edge, so we're not going to worry about that for this tutorial, but I'm sure you get the idea. You can change the seed until you find a pattern that you like, or you can play around with the other settings too. Once you're done, we need to repeat this on the rest of the line layers. And to make that easy, we can right-click on the noise component and copy component. Then click on the next line layer's mask stack. I'm going to collapse these so we can see, and then right-click in the mask area and paste as new. Drag the noise above the top position gradient and use Alt-click to clip it. I did not do it as I went along, but I suggest changing the seed for each one so that none of your donuts will end up looking exactly the same. Rinse and repeat for all of the line layers. On the last one, for the angled donut, put the noise below the top projection modifier, since we want the entire mask to be moved into place as a single unit. I finally remembered about the seed thing, so here I'm just going back through each mask and changing the seed values to make sure none of the donuts will look the same. With that done, there's just one last thing for these vanilla donuts. In almost all the reference images I found, the donut has a sheen. I don't know if it's a glaze or oil or what, but regardless, let's add that touch of overall shine. Select the main layer set. Yours has probably already been renamed to donuts, so our new layer will be added at the top. And then add a solid layer by clicking on the empty square icon. Go through all the maps for this layer and turn off everything except roughness. Then click on the little color circle for roughness and set this to a value of around CA, CA, CA. Just like we saw with our masks, with this layer set to normal blending mode, it obliterates all the roughness detail below it. We can see this quite obviously by looking at the roughness view, and this is not ideal. We can make it better by opening the roughness pane and changing the blend mode here from normal to multiply. And there we have it. Vanilla donuts, ready to be frosted. So that took a bit of time, but we aren't quite done for the day. We're going to go ahead and do the chocolate ones. This is a lot less steps, and I'm going to blast through it quickly since I don't need to explain again about masks and whatnot. Before we start on the chocolate donuts, though, let's organize our layers. Click on the topmost layer, then hold Shift, and click on the bottommost line layer so that they're all selected. Then hit Ctrl-G to group them. Double-click and name it something like Middle Line. Now hold Shift and select the Van Base, Glaze. First let's name the glaze layer. Then hold Shift and select Glaze, Middle Line folder, and Van Base. Hit Ctrl-G again, and then double-click to rename this whole group Vanilla Donuts. And now is a good time to save. We probably should have done that sooner, but let's do it now. Go to File and Save As. Select the mix you already have or type in a new name, whichever you prefer. And then hit Save. Okay, let's knock out these chocolate donuts. Click on the donuts texture set so that we don't make a new layer in the vanilla group. First, I will rename mine like it should be, and then I'll add a new surface layer. I want this to look more like a cake-type chocolate donut, as we can see in this reference image here. So I'm going to remove the concrete filter and then scroll down and find something interesting. I decided to go with this Icelandic moss 2x2 texture. Once that loads in, I'll click the little ID button down here and add a matte ID. Hold Q and click on one of the chocolate donut models. Then I'll double-click on the layer name and rename it to Chalk Base. Let's change the scale here in the placement section to about 70 to get a sort of spongy appearance. For the albedo, I used a color value of 261101, and I left everything else as the default. Now let's add a new layer, a solid layer, which is the plain square up here, and rename it to Chalk Color. Add the matte ID, hold Q, and select the chocolate donut model again. Set the albedo for this layer to a lighter/reddish brown, like 350F00, and then set the roughness down a little to about CB, C9, C8. And of course, this has now colored the entire donut, but we don't want that. So we need to add what? You got it, a mask stack. and then use the mask to have the color applied to some areas and not others. Right-click and add Mask Stack. Then add a mask component. And let's go with Noise and Simplex as the type. Hit 9 on the keyboard so that you can see what this is doing. I'm going to put these settings at Amplitude 2.3, Frequency 60, and remember you can just click in the box to type in the number so it will go above the default max, Octaves 2, Macunarity 2.3, and Persistence 0.5. Hit 1 again to see how this looks in PBR. I think this color is a bit too strong, so I'm going to turn down the albedo opacity to about 0.8. And that makes it blend a lot better now. So this is good, but looking at our reference, we need more variation. There are darker areas, especially inside the spongy parts. So let's duplicate the chalk color layer and rename it to Chalk Dark. Set the albedo back to full opacity and change its hex value to 180600. Click on the mask stack and then right-click on the noise mask to delete it. We are going to use a curvature mask instead. Curvature masks are great. They will use the underlying data from the curvature map that we baked, plus any textures we've added on top, to identify recessed parts called cavities or outer parts called edges. Select curvature from the mask component options and then set it for cavities only. Play with these settings until you like how it looks. I went with tightness at 0.5 and then the levels cranked all the way down to 0, 0. I'm also going to put a little bit of shine inside the cavities by changing the roughness value for this layer to BD, BD, BD. And now just a couple more things and then we'll be done for today. Duplicate the Chalk Dark layer, then double-click and rename it Chalk Light. We're going to use this layer to give the edges a little bit of highlight. Set the albedo to 602 F1C and put the roughness at about B1, B1, B1. Now for the mask stack, we want the curvature mask, but this time we want edges only, so change that here. And then tweak the options however you want. I'm using a tightness of 0, and then I'll raise the upper level to 0.825, but leave the lower one at 0. To break this up a bit more, let's add a noise on top of that. In the components list, choose Noise, Perlin, and set the blend mode to multiply. And then change the various options. I used an amplitude of 4, frequency 200, octaves 2, macunarity 1.9, persistence 0.35, and I actually thought this looked better when I set it to invert. The color is still quite strong, so for the albedo map of this layer, I'll decrease the opacity to around 0.3. The overall effect is subtle, but again, I think small details can really make a difference. Okay, the very last thing we're going to do today is give the chocolate donuts just a tiny bit of overall shine like we did for the vanilla ones. Although they don't have a glaze, we don't want them to be looking all dry and chalky. So add a solid layer, rename it, I called mine Moist, add the matte ID, and use Q-click to set it for the chocolate donuts only. Then turn off all the maps except roughness. Click the color dot for the roughness and change that to a hex value about D1, D1, D1. Just like before, this layer is currently washing out all the roughness detail below it, so we need to set the blend mode to multiply. Now, in PBR view, I think this looks a little too dramatic, so I'm going to go ahead and turn that roughness up a little bit more, and I'll go this time with a hex value of D9, D9, D9. And yep, I think that's looking better. These donuts are starting to look pretty yummy. One last thing real quick, we want to stay organized. So select all your chocolate donut layers and hit Ctrl-G to put them into a group. Name it appropriately, then go ahead and save or save as, whichever you prefer. And we're going to stop here for now. I know that was long and pretty intense, and we aren't even done. We will finish up next time. It's going to be a long one, but I'm hoping it won't be quite as exhausting. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you for the next video. Bye!